It's my pleasure to welcome everybody here this evening. My name is Stephen Powis, and I have the privilege of being Medical Director of the Royal Free London NHS Foundation Trust. So I'd like to welcome everybody, and particularly the Master and friends from the Worshipful Company of Cordwainers, who are our very long-term charitable friends and supporters, to Sir Ian, who I'll introduce, to all my colleagues here at the Royal Free, to members of the Royal Free Association, and everybody else who has come tonight. So it's a year since we last had the lecture, an annual lecture, and I guess a lot has happened during the year. So we are now a much bigger organisation than we were this time last year. So with the acquisition of Barnet and Chase Farm NHS Trust in July of this year, we are now one of the biggest NHS Foundation trusts, one of the biggest trusts in the country, with a staff of around 10,000 people and annual turnover of just under £1 billion. So this is a very large organisation. If any of you, and it'd be too difficult to recognise everybody at the moment, but those of you that have managed to come down from Barnet and Chase Farm to the lectures tonight, a particular welcome, because this is the first lecture we've had as a larger combined organisation. So, I'm sure I don't need to remind you that the Marsden Lecture is the annual lecture that commemorates our founder, William Marsden, who founded the hospital in 1827. I'm sure Sir Ian's going to say a few words about Marsden and the founding of the hospital, so I won't duplicate that. I'm sure many of you know the story of Marsden finding a destitute young girl on the streets, on the steps of a church in the city, who couldn't afford or couldn't get healthcare because she couldn't afford to pay. And that incident changed his view and then led to the formation of what Dominic, chairman of the trust, who's somewhere over there, often says is the precursor to the NHS, the first hospital providing free treatment irrespective of ability to pay, many years before the NHS was formed. Ooh, that's a very loud phone. So, without further ado, so tonight we're going to do a number of things. Firstly, Ian will deliver the lecture. Then Lance Shaw, who's the Master of the Cordwainers, will say a few words. And then we will present our prizes to the UCL's best medical students for each year. So we should be finished by 6, so that is the agenda this evening. So, on to the lecture. And it's a real pleasure to welcome Professor Sir Ian Kennedy to give this year's lecture. So some of you I know Sir Ian, and many of you have heard of Sir Ian. Ian is a lawyer, but we won't hold that against him, who for many years has lectured and written on law and ethics in healthcare and regulation. He is an Emeritus Professor of Health, Law, Ethics and Policy here at University College London, so a friend in that respect, and also visiting Professor at the London School of Economics. I guess his main role at the moment, or one of his main roles, is he is chair of the Independent Parliamentary Standards Authority, which he has led for 5 years now. And I'm sure all of you know that is the authority that oversees MPs' pay, so sets pay for MPs, salaries for MPs if they choose to accept it, and oversees expenses and other things around parliamentary standards. So that is a tough job, and I think over his 5 years he's probably had his fair amount of comment and criticism, but I think that is well established now, and you will all remember the scandal that led to its establishment. But he's been involved in public life for, I guess, 30 years or so, and has earned a particular reputation for work in healthcare. So we probably best know him as chairman of the public inquiry into children's heart surgery at the Bristol Royal Infirmary between 1998 and 2001. And you will remember that inquiry led to the establishment of the Healthcare Commission, which is the precursor to today's Care Quality Commission. And Ian chaired the Healthcare Commission from its formation in 2004 until it was changed into one of its latest forms in 2009. That's not the only thing he's done in public life, of course. In 2009, he chaired the King's Fund inquiry into the quality of general practice in England, and in 2012 he carried out a review of the care of children in the NHS and reviewed the provision of paediatric cardiac surgery in England, Scotland and Northern Ireland. He's also chaired reviews in the past looking at xenotransplantation, so that's pig transplantation and other animals into humans, pets passports, research on service personnel and innovation in pharmaceuticals. He's a former chair of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics and the UK Research Integrity Office, and a former host of the Channel 4 discussion programme After Dark. He's a fellow of the British Academy and an honorary fellow of just about every Royal College there is, College of General Practitioners, Physicians, Paediatrics and Child Health, anaesthetists, surgeons, and the Surgeons of Edinburgh, and of the Chartered Institute of Internal Auditors. He has an honorary DSc from the University of Glasgow, awarded in 2003, and an honorary DM from the University of Birmingham in 2005. As I said, he's a barrister, an honorary bencher at the Inner Temple, and he was knighted in 2002 for services to medical law and bioethics. So a very, very impressive CV, and we are very much looking forward to your lecture tonight. So with his background in healthcare inquiries and regulation, I asked Ian to think about talking to us about whether regulation and inquiries actually have any effect. So his title tonight is Inquiries in the NHS, What's the Point? So Ian.
Having heard that introduction, frankly, I can't wait to hear what I'm going to say, but I don't know about you. I'm delighted to be here because this is my local. I've always lived nearby, and many happy hours have been spent waiting in A&E with my children and waiting in A&E with my children. I'm particularly delighted to be invited to give the lecture in honour of William Marsden, who was a remarkable man. He, as you've heard, he founded the Free Hospital in 1827. First of all in Hatton Gardens, then in Gray's Inn, and now up here. And I'm one of the few people who can remember the old building, the old cottage hospital style building, which I remember walking past on my way to the George or the Roebuck, the two pubs nearby. And of course now it's been replaced by the present building. The hospital received its royal title from Queen Victoria when she ascended to the throne in 1837. But it had been generously supported from the outset by royal patronage and, very importantly, by the Worshipful Company of Cordwainers. That's shoemakers to you and me. Marsden's idea for the Free Hospitals Foundation anticipated by over 100 years what finally emerged as the National Health Service. He founded it on the basis that, quotes, the only passport to admission to the hospital should be poverty and disease, which became in 1947 service free at the point of need, regardless of ability to pay. So he was, to that extent, 100 plus years ahead of his time. Very early on, the Free's principles were put to the test when London was hit by the great cholera epidemic of 1832. All of London's hospitals closed, except the Free Hospital. It stayed open. The same openness, you might think, was seen nearly 150 years later when it opened its doors to a sufferer from the Ebola virus, when elsewhere panic was reigning. In 1842, the Duke of Cambridge organized the raising of funds and presented to Marsden a marvelous silver statuette as a testimonial to the first 15 years of the life. And on one side was inscribed the parable of the Good Samaritan, a reminder again of the values of service and duty which were the inspiration of the Victorian reformers and of the founders of the National Health Service. There were times which you, sir, as the chairman and others in the building will readily recognise, when Marsden would gladly have traded in the silver for some cash. He regularly needed money as the number of patients rose and the need for beds grew. Without royal patronage and the support of the cordwainers, things would well have been different. Marsden, as you've heard, was inspired to act and establish the free hospital when he came across a young woman who was dying on a doorstep. He took her to a number of hospitals, all of which refused to take her. He took her to his home, where she died 3 days later. 180 years on, there are still people, young and old, lying and dying on the doorsteps of our city. I'm the trustee of a charity, Pathway, which was founded 3 years ago, dedicating itself to providing healthcare and support to the homeless of London and elsewhere. The Royal Free gladly agreed to participate in the programme. William Marsden would have been proud. Now to my topic, inquiries in the National Health Service. What's the point? From time to time, something bad happens in the National Health Service, and the cry goes up for an inquiry. Almost always these days a public inquiry. The call used to be for a royal commission, but they were effectively abandoned as a way of addressing public concerns by Mrs. Thatcher, not least because they took so long and were too broadly focused. As A.P. Herbert described a royal commission as rather like an old man with constipation, sitting for a long time and very little ever comes out. Now the call is for a public inquiry. Nothing less will do, nothing less can be trusted. Including nothing can be trusted of this machine, because it's not working. Would it? I went to the trouble of manufacturing a number of slides. I'm going to press that from now on. There's a recent example. Only a few weeks ago, someone calling, what are they calling for? A public inquiry. There's usually a backstory, since not all, or even most circumstances in which something goes wrong, end up with a call for a public inquiry. The backstory is that something bad has happened, is happening, or is said to have happened. The particular hospital or trust doesn't manage things well. It goes into denial, or in some cases into another room. It obfuscates. It clamps down. Communication is poor. Communication is worse than poor. The media latches on. Human interest stories beckon. Politicians are lobbied. They apply pressure. Pressure mounts. That's the backstory. But while that backstory is important, there's something else I'll suggest to you, which has increasingly conditioned the response of those affected by what has happened, which leads them to call for a public inquiry. Above all else, there's grown up what I will call a culture of bouncing along distrust, particularly of institutions and those who speak for them. In part, the hospital in question has undoubtedly brought things upon itself by its behaviour. But in part, I'll put to you, there's a general cultural trend in which hitherto conventional forms of discussion based upon argument and evidence have been overwhelmed by the new rules of discourse through social media. If someone says it, it's true. Calls for evidence are seen not as a means of establishing some proper understanding, but as part of the establishment's way of controlling those who would speak out. In other words, you can't win the argument because when you ask for evidence, it is claimed that by asking that, you're seeking to control the debate. Conspiracies swarm across the internet, and people get caught up in them. So the backstory and this, what I see as a modern form of discourse, produces the default position: bad things have happened, there's a cover-up. A wrong has been perpetrated, there are people who are to blame, they shouldn't be allowed to get away with it. And it's always about people. It's not about systems. It's not about how systems have broken down. For example, in the inquiry I led in Bristol, there was a call always for at least 3 men, doctors, to be disciplined in a variety of manners, including hanging by the testicles from a particularly prominent building. There was never a recognition that in Bristol, to take a child to cardiac surgery required moving that child from one hospital site up a hill, 200 metres down a hill, to another hospital site. And that system, which was part of a system which was utterly unsuitable for looking after young children in such dire need, was as much responsible for what went wrong as anything that any individual might have done. A nurse once recorded that a little child had arrived on her ward, again, in brackets, notes missing as usual. They'd fallen off the trolley as it came down the road, a common occurrence. Systems as well as people. But the default position is there's a cover-up, we must get to the bottom of it. These might be called the non-rational factors which cause people to call for a public inquiry. The backstory, the sense of distrust and cover-up. On top of that, there's probably, indeed, almost always is, some entirely rational grounds which are prayed in aid of a call for a public inquiry, a search for the truth and for some sort of accountability, and the conviction that these will only be achieved through some independent examination of what went on. Those are perfectly valid and perfectly common propositions advanced. But since public inquiries are set up ordinarily by government, clearly the ultimate determinant of whether in fact a public inquiry is set up is what politicians decide in the often frenzied and always muddied world of politics, the politics of the National Health Service. So, if we go back to our question, and I'll keep taking you back to that question, so pay attention. If we return to our question at a crude level, what's the point of a public inquiry? The decision to set one up is a political decision. The point of a public inquiry, therefore, must at some level be political. Now, if it is political, a benevolent commentator would say that the political point or purpose is to commission some independent review which will arm the government with the means to address similar problems in the future. You'll notice I delivered that with a degree of cynicism. To the less benevolent, edging towards the cynical, the political aim is quite simply to get something out of the headlines and off my desk, to get it off the agenda for a period, during which time, if luck will have it, the minister will have moved on to another portfolio, so it's not his job any longer, and the government can do things to make it look as if by the time the public inquiry report, the government is able to say, yes, you're quite right to expose those problems, but thankfully the government has already taken or is in the process of taking action which is going to address. In other words, we're on the where governments always want to be, which is called the front foot. And a secondary political purpose in this rather more cynical vein is to nail the previous government for failings if circumstances are sufficiently propitious. For example, the inquiry into mid-staffs was one in which the previous Secretary of State was advised by a number of people, including George Alberti, who was the previous president of the Royal College of Physicians, and by me, that given that one knew all the facts and they'd been exposed by regulators and whatever, there was no need for another public inquiry. But then the government changed. I'll leave you to join the dots. As in all things political, there is, of course, a bit of the benevolent and a bit of the cynical. But if the political decision is taken, remember the question is, public inquiries, what's the point? If the political decision is taken to set one up, that question, what's the point, doesn't go away. It still has to be answered, albeit perhaps in a second-order way. This is because those of you who have ever been around Whitehall will know, to politicians, the political issue has been resolved. There's going to be a public inquiry. That's it. Move on. Don't have to do anything else. Now they can get back to work and someone else can get on with the public inquiry. Usually, it's not quite always easy to find the someone in some cases, as you're familiar. That was supposed to be mildly humorous. Is this mic on? I was referring to the current difficulty in finding a chair for the meta-inquiry into abuse of children. So, the fact that the politician has addressed it and caused an inquiry to be resolved, to set up, doesn't resolve our question, because that is, to the politician, the answer. It's been answered, but of course, to us, it's the beginning. So someone has to ask herself the question, what am I, now I've been asked to chair a public inquiry, what am I supposed to be doing? What's the point? Now, you may be forgiven for thinking that since we've had so many public inquiries flying about over the last few years, there is some file in some cupboard in the Cabinet Office telling the chair what to do and how to do it. I can assure you no such file exists. There is now some guidance. But the public inquiry is set up, the chair is appointed, in brackets or not, close brackets, the terms of reference are set out, and then, in my experience and the experience of everybody I've ever met who's done this job, you're left to get on with things. By the way, the terms of reference don't indicate the point, they tend to just indicate broadly where you're supposed to be going. So when I was asked to chair a public inquiry, we'll get to the point in a while. I'll get there. We have got 3 hours after all. When I was asked to chair a public inquiry, I went, as is my wont, I went into a corner and I read and thought and spoke to a couple of people and received completely contradictory advice from two senior judges. So I thought I'd better make it up for myself. And I decided my own notion of what the purpose of, or the point of a public inquiry is. In fact, I decided there were 6 purposes, and here they are. Discovering the truth. Notice the truth is in inverted commas, because you'll remember what Pilate once said, what is truth. You would be amazed how many people think that the job of an inquiry is to discover the truth. There isn't one truth. And the fundamental starting point in any kind of dealings with human interaction is to remember that. A doctor will remember saying something to a patient, and the patient will remember something else. To them, both of them, it's their truth. Neither of them is lying, but they're different accounts. Unless you understand that, you're going to head for some difficulty. Discovering the truth, catharsis. Public inquiries are about, to a degree, theatre. They have to be so designed. They have to allow people. I remember a parent suddenly getting out of her handbag, she was giving evidence, a bunch of pieces of paper, which I didn't know what they were. And she said she had her photographs of her child who had sadly died, and would I like to look at them? And so you have to respond immediately and say, of course you would like to look at them. And so she brings them over. And by looking at them serendipitously, since we didn't imagine for a moment it would emerge, we noticed, or at least the bright guy sitting alongside me, noticed that the nurses attending the child in the short time that she lived in and was in that hospital, the nurses kept having different coloured uniforms, which meant to his trained eye that we were dealing with bank nurses. And bank nurses, in other words, nurses brought in ad hoc, bank nurses tend not to be as integrated into the team as you need them, particularly in this high pressure, high quality care. And so it led us on a pursuit of where the nurses came from, which was itself an important line of inquiry. So catharsis is very important. Another man I remember just wanted to read a poem he'd written for his daughter. And that's what he should be able to do. That was his moment. Holding to account is very important. Notice the difference between holding to account and blaming. Blaming is what we do after the event if we just feel angry. Holding to account means that there must have been a pre-existing system and set of rules or principles which everybody signed up to, and then they may or may not have followed them. And it's fair to hold people to account to that. It's not fair to say after the event, well, something went wrong, ergo you're to blame. Although we know it's much more satisfying to start blaming people. Healing is very important. A community is broken. It was a broken community in Bristol, and elsewhere it was in mid-staffs. Staff were not talking to each other. Colleagues walked the streets with their heads down. Parents, there were 2 groups of parents. One, SOS was their signature tune. They wore it on their T-shirts, Save Our Surgeons. The other were quite convinced that their surgeons had killed their children. And how you were able to manage those 2 groups was very important. And when I had finished, the 2 women, both of whose children had died as it happened, came to see me to say that they were going to go to the hospital and lay a wreath in memory of all of the children, and would I come with them? In other words, you've begun that process of understanding. Learning, you have to learn what went on, and then you have to prescribe or make recommendations. And of course, you have to do it as cheaply as possible and as expeditiously as possible. These purposes or points are each and all important. Some of them overlap, some of them are not compatible. For example, holding to account may get in the way of healing. Catharsis may get in the way of discovering the truth because it lets in, as it were, an emotional truth. The challenge is, of course, to get the balance right. Now, even if these are the purposes, the question is, public inquiry, what's the point? And these are suggestions of an aggregation of purposes that make the point. I think we can't answer our question, what's the point of a public inquiry, unless we unravel those purposes. And I think they can be divided into three categories, rather like Gaul. That's a classic reference, obviously. It doesn't matter. They just from time to time to see whether there's anybody awake. There they are. I think there are three categories. And this is quite important to answering our big question. We can call the first category the forensic purpose, discovering the truth, remember? We can call that the forensic purpose. We can call the second category healing, catharsis, and so on. We can call that the social purpose, holding to account, and as I say, catharsis. And the third we can call the remedial purpose. The remedial purpose, learning the lessons and working out what to recommend. Now, setting up an inquiry, remember what's the point, just for what I've called the forensic purpose, is certainly a valid reason for having an inquiry aimed at independently getting at the truth of things, or the bottom of things. It may not, however, in my view, justify the full apparatus and the accompanying time and cost of a public inquiry. I did an inquiry, a review last year in Birmingham, concerned with a breast cancer surgeon, where it didn't have the full panoply of a public inquiry. I didn't need it. I was able forensically to get people to cooperate with me and write a review which exposed the facts in a way that everyone could understand. Equally, just that may not justify a public inquiry. Public inquiries take a long time, they're very expensive. They're never going to be as expensive as the Bloody Sunday inquiry, which took us into hundreds of millions. But the inquiry I did in Bristol was £14 million over 3 years. And what I call the social purpose, alongside that forensic purposes, that's a valid reason, perhaps, for setting up an inquiry. It gives the inquiry a point. But you may think whether a forensic examination plus what one commentator critic, who I thought might be here tonight but I don't see him, called an expensive form of psychotherapy on a grand scale, you may think that those two don't warrant again the time, cost and effort associated with setting up a public inquiry. I pursued those objectives, but I didn't regard them as my principal role. So, are those two purposes the point of a public inquiry? Most would say they're not. Most would say it's the bottom bit. It's the lessons and the recommendations which are the crucial part, and that was certainly my view when I did Bristol. The others are necessary preliminaries and something of a desirable add-on. So, does this remedial purpose, learning, recommending, give a public inquiry a point which may not be otherwise justified? That's what we've got to answer. That's how we're going to answer our question. Now, if I ask, does that third set of purposes justify a public inquiry, I would have to answer, there was a time when you could have said yes. There were public inquiries which did indeed identify lessons which previously were unknown or barely grasped, and made important recommendations. But, ladies and gentlemen, there came a time when observers began to notice, they noticed something. Wherever the hospital, whatever the subject matter, the lessons and the recommendations were always the same. Over time, in the National Health Service, it became increasingly clear what makes things go wrong. We know what puts patients at risk. We know what upsets patients in their interaction with staff. We know what causes junior staff, and there's another issue, calling them junior staff already identifies a problem of hierarchy, which is one of the problems. We know what causes them not to complain or speak up. We know. Public inquiry after public inquiry has identified the same problems and advanced the same solutions. Protocol after protocol has spelled things out. The literature is full of what to do. And just as it became increasingly clear what makes things go wrong, so it became increasingly clear, as I've said, what needed to be done. But what also became increasingly clear is that in some parts of the National Health Service, I think you can guess what's coming next, what's needed to be done is not getting done. The lessons are not being learned. The necessary actions aren't being taken. So, we can wait for another public inquiry, to which I would say, what would be the point? Of course, we can't prevent politicians bending with the wind and setting something up. But if you want more than what I've called the forensic and the social purposes, if you want more from a public inquiry than that, there isn't a point. There's no point in doing it. The lessons are only too well known. Why spend time and millions of pounds saying what's been said before? Instead of public inquiries, what's needed is action. And the most critical action, echoing through report after report, is the need for effective leadership. Leadership at all levels, from the canteen to the kitchen to the ward to the boardroom. I coined a phrase once that what happens at the bedside begins in the boardroom. Hospitals are complex organisations, and you've just described the takeover of Barnet. You didn't use that word. And in that complexity, leadership, in my view, is everything. And leadership is what is failing in those hospitals where things go wrong and where there's call for another public inquiry. Now, don't get me wrong, things go wrong in the best run organisations. What I'm talking about is, when I refer to things going wrong, I mean systemic failures. Let me give you an example. There was a time, you will remember, Steve, when the government issued a target about MRSA. There was a hospital in the south-east of England where a number of hundreds of patients had died from an outbreak of another kind of hospital-acquired infection, Clostridium difficile. And blow me down, there was another outbreak. And another couple of hundred patients died over time. And one of the defenses offered in the face of that was, and you couldn't make it up, there was no target for C. diff. There was only a target for MRSA. That they are both hospital-acquired infections and therefore should cause you to have some attention seems to have been overlooked. Failures of the system of leadership to deliver what is needed and what's well recognized as being required so that patients are well cared for and staff perform to their best. That's what I am interested in. Leadership to produce the right culture. You will not have read a report that the Healthcare Commission produced in which my staff came to me and said, we're not quite sure whether to put this paragraph in. And I read the paragraph and I could see what they were worried about. And I said, do you have evidence of this? Always a lawyer. And they said, yes, we do. And I said, you must put it in because it was iconic. And it was about an elderly lady who wanted to go to the bathroom and she was in her bed, lying in her bed. And so she rang the bell, seeking assistance. And then she rang the bell somewhat more urgently because no one came. And more urgently, and more urgently. And I get goosepimples thinking about remembering what was said. Because a nurse appeared at the head of the ward, and do you know what she said? She said, go in the bed, dear, I'll be with you later. Now that's shocking. And an easy response is to say, that nurse should never work again, feet should never touch the ground. But that would be, in my view, an ill-considered response. The question to ask is, what happened to the culture of that institution that nurse who did not leave home intending to harm anybody when she set off to work, felt that she had no alternative but to say what she did? And it was said, oh, we're £40 million deficit and so on and so forth. Well, the culture was such that it produced that response. There's a need, therefore, and I'm closing in 3 minutes, need to confront, ladies and gentlemen, what Al Gore called an inconvenient truth. The state of leadership in parts of the NHS gives and should give us cause for concern. I could cite many examples. I just mentioned bullying. Bullying, in my view, is one of the most common and one of the most corrosive problems in hospitals up and down the land, particularly amongst nurses. The commitment by leaders and those whom they lead to the principle that the National Health Service is a service. It's not exactly difficult to notice the last of those 3 words, National Health Service, actually is the word service, that we're there to serve. Too often, that principle bends in the face of bureaucratic procedures or self-serving attitudes. Newcastle and Leeds vying with each other as to who should get patients on whom to do pediatric cardiac surgery. Leadership which is prepared to confront this state of affairs is too often lacking, and patients and staff get the wrong end of the bargain. I know the NHS is a political enterprise. I know politicians blithely set targets and talk the language of shame and blame, ably assisted by the media. And I know that that is an enormous challenge for leaders, particularly against the background now of differing agendas from Monitor and from CQC and of financial constraint. And I'm aware of that. Equally, the challenge is made the greater when the calls for a change of culture are picked up by those who don't understand anything about culture. They underestimate the complexity of the process we call culture. The rhetoric of cultural change is used, but what's proposed is new crimes. The word criminal is used 44 times in the executive summary of France's report. What's proposed is a greater use of regulators as police. Regulators aren't police or shouldn't be seen as police. And a preoccupation, almost an obsession with whistleblowing. But whistleblowing isn't the answer, it's the problem. You only need whistleblowing if people aren't confident to speak. So any good leadership system is one which creates an environment in which people do not have to go round the back because they can go to the front and express their concerns. Whistleblowing is defeatist. It's admitting that which should never be allowed. Good hospitals with good leaders deal with these challenges that the NHS throws up. But in other parts of the National Health Service, the care of patients teeters on the edge of safety and on the edge of humanity. Another public inquiry could be round 1,000 corners. But as I've said to you, what would be the point? We know the answers. We don't have to discover them again. We have the lessons. We don't have to spend years and millions finding them out. We simply have to implement them. And only good leadership from the top to the bottom will get us there. Thank you.
Well, I'm sure, like me, everybody in the audience found that a forensic analysis. I think the first thing to say, which we wouldn't expect anything less, but an entirely refreshing analysis. I think you weren't afraid to, as I would expect, to stand up and go against some of the currents. And I think for me especially, and I'm sure for others who, many of the people in the audience are in leadership capacity, as you say, all the way from the canteen to the boardroom. I think that was quite an inspirational and refreshing talk, so thank you. Now, Ian has agreed to take questions. We do have a few minutes, so if anybody would like to ask a question, then pop your hand up. We do have a microphone, but it may be best if you just shout out and I'll repeat it.
Would it be at all appropriate if the governors of an institution or hospital imposed a moratorium on minor failings, so that the people could log them onto the computer system, confessing what had happened openly, without feeling that they had to run the gauntlet and possibly sacrifice their career, having admitted a mistake?
Moratorium on what?
So the question was, should there be a window of opportunity for staff of the hospital or organisation to admit mistakes, admit errors, to report incidents without feeling that doing so would harm their professional lives and careers?
I understand that.
An amnesty, if you want.
I understand amnesties are one technique, and obviously that's a proper conversation to have at a variety of levels with those who are in the capacity to make that decision. Another mechanism which I've recommended is to borrow what I believe is a military metaphor or analogy, which is that there is a person employed by the hospital who answers only to the chair and the chief executive and has access under all circumstances to the chair and the chief executive and can demand some report on whatever he or she brings, and that person can hear from anyone in any part of the institution on a completely confidential basis what is on their mind, whether it be their own conduct or someone else's conduct, and then can take that in a confidential manner to the chief executive or the chairman. That's one way of diffusing or suffusing the institution with an institutional mechanism that can respond to those levels of concern, as well as amnesties. But the most important way of all is to inculcate into all of the people who work around you a trust that you can share, whether it's in the M&M meetings or whatever other meeting, things that you weren't happy with, either in someone else's behavior or your own. And if that attitude, which has to be created by good leaders who have to give you that confidence, if that attitude can begin to prevail, then people will come forward with concerns. Obviously, currently, young doctors in particular and nurses speak as if they had a reporter on one shoulder and a lawyer on the other shoulder. And we need to get beyond that. One of the recommendations I made in Bristol was that we should simply get rid of clinical negligence litigation, rather on the model of New Zealand. When I went to see the Lord Chancellor to make that recommendation, he sent 4 of his heavies to talk to me, and I put the view that blame was getting in the way of being able to talk. And the response I got, and this is a direct quote, was, over here in the Lord Chancellor's department, we believe in blame. I made the recommendation anyway, but it didn't get anywhere. But there are a lot of mechanisms you can think of which, taken together, begin to create a climate which is different from the climate currently prevailing.
Time for one more quick question. John.
I thought I talked up.
John.
Can I go back to your very start, where you said that the Royal Free has grown into a very big organisation, and culture is something that actually it's about how people behave. Is there not a correlation, a relationship between organisations that are so big they become very difficult to manage compared to, say, a small organisation where you can actually influence through good communication the behaviours and the norms and the values of an organisation compared to, say, a massive bureaucratic. It seems that it's not a coincidence that all the large organisations, whether they be the railways or whatever, have the same sorts of issues to face.
So the question is, relationship between size and culture.
Well, first of all, culture isn't just about individuals, it's about organisations. Organisations bring their own traditions. This organisation has a huge set of traditions which one hopes inspires those who work. There's no necessary relationship between size and anything, but here we're talking about size and culture. And you look at an organisation as big as Shell or the nuclear power industry, very complex. If things go wrong, people die. They organise life very well. One of the things that strikes me, and Steve may come back on it, is that the people who run our large organisations in healthcare are not particularly trained to run organisations. They are ex-doctors or ex-nurses, and lovely for it. But I'm not sure that that's the right way to manage complex organisations. And one of the recommendations I made at Bristol was that managers should be required, just as physicians and nurses are required, to go through some kind of training and registration process and periodic revalidation. That particular recommendation went down, as you might imagine, like a lead balloon with the chief executive of the National Health Service. But I think it's still something. Andy Burnham toyed with it not very long ago, but dropped it again. I think it's part of what I don't think that because the organisation is big, it's ipso facto going to be disorganised. Good organisations aren't. They have to tap into that culture, they have to use it, and they have to atomise how things work so that there are good lines of reporting, but there's good delegation of responsibility. I have the luxury of being a commentator without having actually any responsibility to do anything, but I've seen it work, and there's no reason why the National Health Service, first card it plays whenever you have these conversations, we are unique. They are not unique, they're just a rather large, clumsy, oftentimes badly led, badly organized organization, which when it works well, like here, is a joy to behold.
Right, thank you, Ian. I think two very full points. And I'm really grateful that I've got an MBA as well as a medical degree, so but doing exams when you're in your 50s is tough work, I'll tell you. Right, okay, so thank you, Ian, and I'll have another opportunity to thank you at the end, but we're now going to quickly move on to the final parts of this evening. So firstly, it's my great pleasure to invite the Master of the Cordwainers, Ms. Lance Shaw, to come and say a few words. Lance.
Right. Good evening, everyone. Professor Powers, Sir Ian, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me very great pleasure to be here this evening with my wife, Nolan, and many other Cordwainers. Since I joined the Cordwainers in the 1970s, the Royal Free has always played a prominent part of my Cordwainer knowledge. In fact, when I was a junior warden in 1990, I helped to organise a visit here by the Cordwainers. The hospital had a great reputation then, and it seems to be even better now. One just cannot fail to be impressed by what's happening with your investment in clinical teaching and research facilities, training more students. And when you add the inclusion of Barnet and Chase Farm hospitals, as well as your link with UCL, the acclaimed medical school in London, this makes for a wonderful combination. With hospitals such as the Royal Free in their portfolio, medical students at UCL are extremely privileged and well positioned for their future careers as doctors and leaders in the medical profession. We Cordwainers, as you've heard expressed a couple of times this evening, have had a long and continuous association with the Royal Free Hospital. Our links go back, as you heard, well over 150 years to the days of William Marsden, who founded this hospital, and who was master of our livery, the Cordwainers, in 1849. In fact, he would have been wearing a badge like this then. Not only that, but what we've developed is various ties. And this is one of our livery ties. And I had it pointed out to me just this evening that it looks very much like the University Medical Society tie. What a coincidence. So at least you can recognize it. Anyway, the Worshipful Company of Cordwainers is one of the oldest livery companies in the City of London. Our roots go back to 1272. We received a royal charter in 1439, so quite old. Now our work is mainly philanthropic and we support a wide range of charities, but in spite of our age, we have a young and vigorous outlook and have developed an exciting 2020 vision, as can be seen on our relaunched website. Do visit it, it's a fascinating website. It gives you the timeline as well, which goes from 1272 right up to the current day. As part of that, one of our aims is to double the amounts given by Cordwainer charities to targeted external beneficiaries from the 2012 levels. So today, besides having the honour of supporting the top medical students at UCL, we also support the nurses here through a joint charity dedicated to the help in the further education and development of nurses. The Royal Free Hospital Nurses Trust is well established and now able to move forward as a result of a recent legacy of nearly $750,000 left to the charity by a local resident. In addition, I'm pleased that we are also able to help in the Music Outreach Therapy Programme, which we set up in conjunction with the Guildhall School of Music and Drama. But tonight is about celebrating the success of medical students, and I feel enormously privileged to have the honour of presenting the prizes to the top students in each of the year groups. Professor Pius, thank you very much for having us.
So without further ado, Ian, a superb lecture. I know you live locally, so not far to go, but thank you for coming and inspirational. Thank you everybody for coming, particularly the Master and our great friends at the Cordwainers. Have a safe trip home, and I'll see you again next year. Thank you.